All right, everybody, welcome to our January Mad About Art events. We want to thank you for coming. If you haven't yet renewed, please renew as soon as possible. We have our new website, madaboutartdenver.com, and we hope that you will check that out. So I want to let you know this is being recorded. Our hope is to put all of our talks on our website. And so I just wanted to let you know, I muted everybody, but it does allow you to unmute yourself. So one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to thank Mary Willis, who was our president last year when we started our first year of Mad About Art. And I have taken over the presidency, and Hannah is now program chair. So thank you so much. And Hannah, why don't you introduce Christy?
We'll get started. And you might just, if you do have a question, put it in the chat and I'll kind of monitor that. And if it's appropriate, try to get it answered at that point, or we'll have some time at the end to cover some more. But I'm so happy to welcome my friend Christy, who's now living in Ojai, California, but lived in and raised her family in Denver. Currently, she is a consultant working with businesses, designing work sessions, including retreat facilitation, board organization, strategic planning with an emphasis on gender issues. She owned Sebastian Moore Gallery in the late 70s and 80s, where providing art consulting to businesses and nonprofits took up their time. Some of those were the Arvada Center for the Arts, Camp Children's Center, Cherry Creek Arts Festival, Boy Scouts of America, Denver Film Society, the MCA, Art Students League, and many, many more. She was also, as she mentioned just a bit ago, executive director of the Foundation for Denver Performing Arts. During working with businesses and private clients in development of art collections, she advises on art purchases, commissions, appraisals, installations of artworks, and that only scratches the surface of what she's done and what she's an expertise in. So please, please welcome Christy Sebastian, my dear friend.
Thanks, Hannah. And hi, everybody. It's a big group, which is nice to see. I'm glad everyone has an interest in art. It means it'll stay alive during this difficult time. And the future of contemporary art starts today because it will be completely different than it was a year ago before COVID. That's another topic. The art market's another topic entirely, but it will be greatly impacted and has been by what's been going on. I'm going to just put this out here because if anybody wonders about the art market, it is almost a $70 billion annual business. So when I had a gallery in Denver, and I think I can aptly say that Sebastian Moore Gallery was the first major contemporary gallery in Denver, there were probably about 3 committed buyers. And across the country, there might have been 300 people who were interested in contemporary art. That's changed dramatically, obviously. So contemporary art has become the biggest piece of the auction market and the biggest piece of an investment market, which really wasn't true until the 80s. So it's still a very young market in terms of buying and selling, but it's been a natural progression of art really at the end of the 19th century. So one of the questions I was asked to answer, which is a very tough question and discussion, which requires much more time than we have, is what is modernism versus contemporary art? What is modern art and what is contemporary art? And every true historian will have a different answer to this. And in some ways it's completely irrelevant. An arbitrary cutoff date for modern art was 1945 for some reason. And I think that is because from the perspective from American art, that fostered the first wave of truly American contemporary art. Our art was largely European based before that, European sensibilities, a European art look, and many immigrants in the Second World War obviously came to this country and had a huge impact, particularly in New York, with the abstract expressionists. So that's one way to delineate contemporary versus modern art. Modern art really came about with a rejection of traditional academic art, which was heavy in the late 19th century. Art was done in studios, there were portraits, there were commissions, but there was not art which we would consider today to be done for popular reasons, for doing art for the sheer joy of doing it, or the sheer pleasure of thinking about color or light on an object. Art was done in very rigorous academic ways. And with the Industrial Revolution, which modernism is really a response to, modern art really reimagined what art is and reinterpreted what art is. So Impressionism, which is everyone's favorite period of art, was really a very radical departure from academic art. And these Impressionists who were much more interested in the formal dismantling of the subject. So what does it look like just to focus on the light on water? What does it look like to just deal with color like the Fauves did? What does it look like to do a street piece or people out working on the farm? It was radical notions that art was for the people. It opened up whole new subject matters. It questioned what art was about. So the Impressionists really were those people. The first Impressionist show in France was largely rejected and mocked. It was very upsetting to people that this radical turn by these upstarts took place. So it was a while before that was considered acceptable. And any of you who have ever taken an art history course know you can get completely lost in the isms. So from Impressionism, there's Fauvism, there's German Expressionism, there's Abstract Expressionism, there's Post-Impressionism. There's an ism about every 4 feet. So there's no one style that really defines modernism. It's if I read somewhere, someone said it's a more optimistic period in art. I wouldn't say that of the German Expressionists, but which was all a response to the war, First World War. But it is a more joyful period in terms of the people who were painting. People who love color, Matisse, Derain, you got color every which way. You got green trees and purple skies and pink cows. If it was about pointillism, it was about the juxtaposition of color and the great Seurat painting hanging at the Chicago Art Institute. The Sunday in the Park with George painting is a unbelievable example of what that study of formalism, the breaking down of what the function of art should be, what it should look like, what it does is the joyful part of modernism. I would say that contemporary art, well, let's pick 1945 as a cutoff date. Some people include the abstract expressionism, Pollock being probably the most famous as the first truly American form of art. His exploration was psychological. So contemporary art really threw the baby in the bathwater out. Then artists determined that there were no boundaries on the exploration of art. So one of the big influences on contemporary art and modern art was photography. By the time we get to contemporary art, it's video and film, which have huge impacts on what art looks like. And media, how media came out, the whole messaging business and art, it becomes very political. It becomes less optimistic and more in your face. There's more confrontation in contemporary art. We can still look at a lot of modern art and even despite the message or its intent, see it as beautiful. I don't think anyone would argue that Van Gogh or Paul Cézanne or Gauguin didn't make beautiful paintings, regardless of what it is they were after. The final picture, and most of them are pictures, were things that are quite accessible visually and beautiful to look at. That is not necessarily true, nor the function of contemporary art when we look at it. There's a lot about contemporary art that is fairly unknowable. Just, it's very hard to walk up to a conceptual piece and have the information and be able to respond positively or negatively. We simply don't know enough about it. So the question is, how do we look at contemporary art? How do we look at living art? And contemporary, really the definition is living artists working. But because we now we're into our 75th year of contemporary art, I don't think that label works anymore. I'm always very interested that we have museums to contemporary art because there's no definition for that. That would mean you could only show living artists, and most contemporary museums, of course, show artists that are living and dead of artists who were formerly in contemporary art. So I don't think any of these labels are very important. I think it's a term that is now in the lexicon of the art world, that contemporary is what we're looking at now. And there's
I'll start the share screen.
No, I want to say a couple more things.
Okay.
When you're looking at art, when you go in, and most of you, I assume, have interest in art or you wouldn't be here. But the tired old things of people saying when they look at art, like my kid could do that, how much does that sell for and why? I think the best way to approach a contemporary work of art is to do it what the Buddhists would say, the mind of a child. Without prejudice, without judgment, because I will tell you that I've been in art all of my life, and there's much of it. I go to Miami Basel about every other year, and I look at artwork and I go, I have no idea what this is. Nothing resonates, nothing comes to mind, nothing comes up, I can't make it up. I think we've all experienced that. And I think where I live, we have a contemporary classical music festival here every summer, which is famous throughout the world. I know nothing about contemporary classical music. And I go to this festival and I hear the music and I look around and I think, I miss this. I totally missed this. And what I decided to do was start going to the lectures so that when I went and heard the music, I'd at least have one or two words I could use that would resonate in my vocabulary of anything. And I think that's, why would you know about all of the arcana in contemporary art if this isn't something you do or follow every day? So forgive yourself. It isn't anything that any of us will ever be expert at. But I think if we come with an open mind, with the eyes of a beginner, we have more of an opportunity to see the beauty and judge the piece differently. Okay, now take the visual, Helen. So I'm going to start with the two artists. Oh, all these pieces, I think, except for the Mao, are at the Denver Art Museum. And I picked these because you can go see them and maybe see them differently now that we're looking at them together. So the first one is Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol arguably is one of the 5 most important artists of the last century. And I would posit it's not so much because he was a great artist, but he was a great innovator and he predicted an entire movement of art. So when I say contemporary art in America started after the 40s, I believe it started with pop art. And Andy Warhol's entire, very prodigious career, he made thousands of artworks, are pulled from what we refer to as popular culture. He went past, you know, doing romantic pictures of farmers planting seeds into picking soup cans up from the shelf and saying, if you, which was actually early, the Dadaists did this as well, so I can't give him full credit for doing this with Duchamp's urinal, but common themes that are out in popular media. What is in our everyday life that would never be conceived of as an art object? And Warhol was the person who picked up the soup can and said, this is an art piece. If you remove it, you cast it in bronze and you paint it, it's not a soup can anymore. It's an object. It becomes a sculptural form. So all of these famous, his whole famous series of famous people, Mao being one of them, is taking a media reference, a popular image, and reimagining it in a different format. The other thing Warhol did, which had a huge effect in art, is he really was the proponent of the multiple. So silk screening, which was never considered an art medium until Warhol, literally cranked off thousands of images, silk screening them, which then made it into the marketplace. And what he's, you know, from his viewpoint is, what difference does it make? So he was the person, one of the first people to really explore all of the different media, film, silk screening, object, theater, dance, on what a piece of art could be. So Warhol cracked it open for everybody else. An interesting note, and we can't spend more time on him, is that his market, the worth of his artwork was very, very minimal by the time he died. His blast of fame was over. His artwork wasn't selling for much. There was too much of it on the market. And a gallerist named Larry Gagosian came on the scene and changed that reality, of which Warhol never saw the results of, but his foundation has, of being one of the most expensive artists ever sold at auction. Okay, followed by, next, Jean-Michel Basquiat, who is a different generation, but he and Andy were friends. Jean-Michel died at 27 from a drug overdose. In his lifetime, he made an astounding amount of art, over 1,500 drawings. Even though he was quite young, he was discovered by a gallerist, even you know, sort of in a drug basement. He started out as a street artist. So here's something that defines contemporary art: is it doesn't matter where it is. Sadly, I cannot get into video and performance and installation art in anything this short, but I think what you see in terms of street art, in terms of artists who wrote on subway walls, who write in slums, who write on buses, is this immediacy of the message that is out there, that the walls of the gallery and the museum get dissolved and art becomes in your face wherever you are. This was very popular in the 80s and the 70s and the 90s. And although Basquiat did not live to see his fame reach to he's also one of the most expensive artists you can buy, because there's a limited amount, and he died so young. But, and this is, I'm going to say this out loud, this isn't a great Basquiat, but there's plenty of them you can see. But it gives you an idea of just that sense of imagery. He was Haitian and Puerto Rican. That comes into his artwork. He grew up on the lower south side or the lower east side of New York. You can see that. You can see where he was a graffiti artist. All of that is very intimate in his artwork. And he also happens to be a really terrific artist. There's a great film that Julian Schnabel did on Jean-Michel Basquiat back in the 90s sometime. Totally worth seeing. It's a beautiful film. All right, so talking about words on artwork, let's go to Barbara Kruger. it's our pleasure and discuss. Two things I'll say about Barbara Kruger. She is now probably in her late 70s. She could be in her 80s. She's an early feminist artist. Okay, a word about women in art. Not until very recently did we give women the same credit as men in terms of being important people in this whole contemporary art movement. There are some appalling numbers of how much less great women artists sell versus great male artists, which has nothing to do with anything other than gender. And that period is coming to a grinding halt as we speak. The auction market, like the world market, has discovered that women, and the next biggest piece of the auction market are Black artists, that there is a world of talent that has yet to be mined in terms of those people. But Barbara Kruger, I refer to this stuff as word art. And this bothers a lot of people. Why are they writing on their artwork? And many, many artists, including many California artists, you'll see in Ed Ruscha, do the messaging. So Barbara uses traditional black and white photography, and then she banners the artwork. And these pieces can be huge. They can be billboard size. So she is taking the popular medium of billboards and putting up a feminist message. I don't think it's really that hard to see that in this particular piece. It's our pleasure to discuss you. Forget shame, forget innocence, forget morality, forget heroes. There's definitely a woman on a cross with a gas mask. This is as in your face as this kind of word art gets, and that's her effectiveness. Some of her titles are "I shop, therefore I am," "Your body is a battleground," "Know nothing, believe anything, forget everything." I think some of these other women artists who are her contemporaries, Cindy Sherman, Sarah Charlesworth, Laurie Simmons, Judy Chicago, Miriam Shapiro, are all giving that feminist message of this art that came out of the 70s and the 80s, and they remain strong and very important artists to this day, followed by generations of other feminist artists. Okay, Ed Ruscha. This is Ed Ruscha, who's probably my favorite piece of public art in Denver is in the library, and it's Ed Ruscha's. I think it is a brilliant piece of art. If you haven't gone down there and just spent an hour with it, I highly recommend it. He's a very California artist. He was very influenced by car culture out here. If you ever get to the point of talking about why West Coast art and East Coast art are so different, he would be one of the great people to talk about. A lot of these artists started out as graphic artists, including Warhol, who designed shoe ads. Ed started out as a graphic artist. He did a great piece, which he put in several of these in books, where he photographed every building on Sunset Strip and made a book out of it in the 60s. His word paintings, there's many word painters, probably one of the famous ones right now that I'm sure you will see a piece of, you may have one, is Glenn Lingon, who is a Black artist whose works are done in very dark charcoal and dirt and burnt sticks, and it's very much about the Black experience. Great artist. But Ruscha was early on in this, and his are called anamorphic paintings, which is you are meant to see these from a certain site. So they're not head-ons. It's like looking at billboard art that goes back into space, and you're reading it as it is going away from you. And he depends very much on what it is said, that these are references, personal references for everyone who sees it differently. So looking for the meaning of this is not important, because the meaning is only important if it has meaning in terms of what you think it is. So again, a very, very prolific artist. And the Denver Art Museum just has, or the library is just one of the terrific Ed Ruschas. So go down and see that. Okay, so we get into one of the more baffling parts of contemporary art, which is minimalism. This is an Agnes Martin. Agnes, along with Georgia O'Keeffe, are women who left New York, stopped painting for a while, and lived in the New Mexican desert alone for years. And actually, Agnes is Canadian, but she's very much a New York artist. And she would tell you she's not a minimalist, but she's got thrown in there. So what is minimalism? So what did they want? So at the point when conceptual art gets extreme, as in minimalism, it's like, let's take all of the stuff out of the picture and see what is left. So Agnes starts from a grid. So when you approach this painting, first of all, I think it's really important to look at art as mood. What kind of mood gets told in this painting? And I would say, having seen many of Agnes Martin's work, serenity always comes to mind. She was deeply inspired by Zen Buddhism, and I think you can tell that. She refers to herself as an abstract expressionist because I think she was dealing with the spiritual part of life, particularly hers. So she wanted the perception of perfection and transcendental reality. So knowing anything about Zen Buddhism would help see this piece, but it's basically a grid. What makes her not a minimalist is she is a painter. And on all of Agnes Martin's work, you will see the painter's hand, you'll see the brushstroke, you'll see the pink, you'll see the subtle gradations of color, even though the colors are very subtle. They're all 60-inch squares or 72-inch squares. And I think because I love Agnes Martin's work, I see a very feminine side of painting in her work in the minimalist movement. They're very beautiful canvases, and seeing it in a picture is a much diminished experience from seeing these in real life. She's a beautiful painter, was. And obviously inspired, as was Georgia O'Keeffe, by the New Mexican desert and that sense of endless space that exists in the desert. Okay, Donald Judd. So, good for me for picking the hard pieces. Total minimalist, and if anybody has heard of Marfa, Texas, you can thank Donald Judd. He was a major artist in his time. He still is considered the progenitor of all kinds of art movements. He used the term stacks and boxes. So that's what he did to a great extent. He said they are not sculptures because they're fabricated. He rarely fabricated them. He hated the art world, as many artists do, and went to Texas, and he wanted to find space for monumental art. So Dia Beacon in New York was the first place dedicated to monumental art, and Marfa was Donald Judd's tribute to his fellow artists who didn't have a place to really show these huge pieces. So John Chamberlain, Ronnie Horn, Carl Andre, Robert Irwin, all went to Marfa and did shows and left artwork. He was about the constructed object, that what you see is what you get. They're often plywood, a very common material. He did paint, and if you see a lot of Judd's work, if you ever have the opportunity to see a retrospective, you will see the genius in his artwork. He started out as an abstract expressionist and got to here. It's always like, wow, that was quite a journey. All right, so I'm clearly very influential on lots of artists. Here's one of your hometown artists. This is Jordan Castile. Fatima, she's a young artist still. And she comes out of a long tradition of portrait painting, which has been around forever. Now, I'll remind you, before modernism, before the Impressionists said, we're not doing this anymore, we're going to do something else, art for thousands of years was made because someone paid you to make a portrait of the king on a horse, decorate the palace. It really was in a blip in art history. The 17th century Dutch painters found wealthy middle-class patrons to do small paintings for their small homes. But for the most part, it was royalty and people and the church that supported artists. Consequently, the name of artists weren't very important unless there was a standout like Michelangelo or Da Vinci or somebody who surpassed anyone's expectations of decor. So, but out of this grand tradition of portrait painting, we have Jordan, who is not doing the king on the horse or Princess Fatima's portrait with her mother. These are regular people in her neighborhoods, people she finds who are doing things like selling whatever she's selling in her kiosk. So she photographs them and then she takes them back and reconfigures. Her intent is to do primarily Black subjects, which if you saw her show at the Art Museum, is clear. But they're very optimistic paintings. The people in her paintings it's not such a political message. I think it's a more neutral portrait painting message. These people get elevated to being seen in a positive way. The next artist, and who I did not know anything about, I will tell you that you have an amazing collection of Chinese art at the Denver Art Museum because of a large number of paintings that were given to the Art Museum about 20 years ago. So it's a period of art like in the 90s that everyone was buying Japanese and Chinese art because the world opened up into an international art market in a way that was inconceivable in the last century. So what we have now are all of these different cultural references that we have to sort of be able to incorporate as we view these things. So a lot of the Chinese artists went back to their heritage of imagery, Chinese art of ink on paper, for instance. And then they took traditional methods or traditional settings, and then they change it. So Wei Dong, who largely works with the female body in his paintings, takes this imagery of Christ being let down from the cross in this weird juxtaposition of someone in a Mao worker shirt with these someone in a clown suit, and unpacking the symbolism in this would be so much fun because there's so much going on. There's a reference to Western art, obviously. There's a big reference to Christianity. All of the traditional male figures are female. What this has to do with the Chinese landscape, I'm sure is in there. And by the time you get to something like this, you really need to read about the artist. You go online, you look them up as I did, and you go, oh my God, I didn't even know this guy existed. And there are thousands of absolutely unique Chinese artists who are working in unique ways. So your museum has a great collection of contemporary Chinese art.
We have a few more minutes, Christy.
Yep, I'm almost done too. Okay, Jenny Seville. So this is a self-portrait. Jenny Seville was part of the young British artist movement of the late 90s, mostly female bodies, only she picks hermaphrodites, transvestites, plastic surgery victims when it's going wrong. She's sort of like Diane Arbus in that way. She likes the more unusual bodies. They're all very Rubenesque. They're very huge paintings. So size, again, in contemporary art can really make a difference. So what you're looking at is the artist through a piece of glass, which she is lying on. So her portrait is literally, she's lying on glass. And just the distortion and the difficult perspective and the confrontation of this I remember when I saw my first piece of hers, she was part of a group with Damien Hirst and Tracy Ehrman and all of that. Confrontation is when you look at these things, you are looking literally up at this enormous Rubenesque nude from her crotch up, and they can't be more in your face. She's also happens to be a really terrific painter. All right, Robert Irwin, I'll pull through these last few pretty quickly. Next slide, Ellen.
I can't seem to,
It's Irwin, right?
yeah, I can't, trying to get it for some reason. I think my computer,
Oh,
the computer is stopped there. So
whoops.
let's stop here,
All
and
right.
I will stop the sharing. And now, and we'll have questions at the end. Now we're going to hear from Amy Ellingson. She is an American contemporary abstract painter. She lives and works in Santa Fe now. She got her BA in studio art from Scripps and her MFA at Cal Arts. She taught at San Francisco Institute of Art from 2000 until 2011. She shows nationally, internationally, and in many famous museums, and also has a very large piece at the San Francisco International Airport in Terminal 3. She shows in Denver at the Robichon Gallery. She just had an exhibit and represented by them. And she's also had two print projects at Sharks Inc., which is in Lyons. So Amy.
Okay, hi everybody. Let me try to share my screen here. And okay, I hope you're all seeing and hearing me. Yes?
Yep.
Okay, terrific. Okay, well, thanks for having me today. It's so nice to see you all and your very vibrant group, and thanks for your interest. This is a recent picture of my new studio that I built in Santa Fe. I'm a California native and San Francisco Bay Area native, so I've been in Santa Fe for a couple of years now, and I'm loving it. I thought I would just start by doing a super quick recap of my show at Robichon that I just had this summer, and then I'll kind of talk about the conceptual foundation for my work, talk a little bit about process, and then circle back and show you some work of the last couple of years, including public art and prints and a couple of recent exhibitions. So the recent show at Robichon was called Firmament, and I'm just going to quickly show you a few install shots. I don't know, maybe some of you saw it. I know it was difficult with COVID, but I will circle back to all of this, but I want to just kind of give you a little context. Okay, so I think it's great to follow Christy's good discussion of the difference between modernism and contemporary art. Another way we can talk about contemporary art is talking about postmodernism. And when we talk about what came after modernism, I think there's, we could easily say there's a cynicism that kind of entered into art making, a kind of hyper intellectualism, I think. And a deconstruction of every sign and symbol and methodology for making work, and then a very strategic building back of those things where really nothing is at face value. Everything is full of signs and symbols and signifiers, and that making in itself and authorship in itself are in question. So for anyone who is a postmodern painter, the question became, how do we make relevant paintings anymore at all, especially in the age of technology and this really excessive digital stimulation that we are all in all day long. And so I'm particularly interested in this kind of more systemic conceptual approach and how that kind of dovetails, or can it dovetail into something that's more gestural, personal, and still something that is heartfelt without being Pollyanna-ish, and something that brings back a little bit of that power of the individual, but also being very aware of history of the last 50 years. Okay. Okay, so the ways that I do this are basically through systems and repetition. So I'm going to talk about that for a couple of minutes. I do that several ways. One is through the use of the computer as a tool. All of my work is and has been composed on a computer for 30 years. And if you think of 30 years ago, computers did not do much at all. My first Macintosh computer was a 2 megabyte system. Okay, most pictures you take on your phone are bigger than that. And so, the minute I sat down with a computer for the first time, I thought, well, this is interesting. This could be a tool that can help move abstract painting forward somehow. I didn't know how I would do that, but that's the thought I had when I sat down in the computer lab at CalArts in 1990. And so the things that I'm doing are basically appropriating and repurposing aspects of my own work to create this kind of very self-referential system in a sense. My desktop of my computer typically can look something like this, where I've designed the paintings in Photoshop. All of the forms in the paintings are derived from a very, very simple language of forms that I initially created in Illustrator. They're things that were like grids, very, very simple things, and basically related to minimalism in a sense. Bringing those things into Photoshop, pushing them through filters, chopping them up, spitting them out, recomposing them, layering them into these very complicated compositions. And so when I'm working on a new design for a painting, my desktop could look something like this, where I might be grabbing a layer from one, pulling it into the other, stretching it to kind of fill. I think of these layers basically as modules, which again is kind of a minimalist technique. So there's this kind of language, this palette of forms, if you will, that are just repeated again and again on top of each other. Again, here's what my workspace looks like. Another aspect of the work is serial production. So I create closely related groups of paintings that kind of elaborate and reiterate in order to establish and assert identity through resemblance and through difference. So I will often create groups of paintings that the titles are identical variation. These 4 paintings are almost identical to each other, believe it or not. All of the layers are the same in each one, just using different colors or shuffling those layers. I think of it almost as like DNA. You and your siblings might, one of you has brown hair, one has blonde hair, blue eyes, brown eyes, male, female, tall, short, that these different aspects of identity can actually be expressed through this shuffling of, basically the same information. Here's another that's even more closely related. Another way is through a very restricted language of forms, multiplying, replicating them, resulting in a visual field that takes advantage of, opticality as well as physicality. So I'm looking back, dovetailing into some of Christy's comments, looking back at art history. Yes, minimalism comes into play. Yes, op art comes into play. Abstract expressionism comes into play. So I'm looking back at a lot of these things and kind of synthesizing them. Here's a kind of a detail of one of my paintings from a few years ago. A lot of these forms are very similar to each other. The paintings are oil on panel. Those white shapes that you see that are kind of on the surface are encaustic. So they actually are dimensional. Encaustic is a beeswax medium. It has a thicker body than oil paint. So thinking about repetition, I would posit that it's an essential quality of painting. Most artists are repeating themselves a lot. Subject matter is revisited again and again. Physical processes are repeated until mastery is achieved. And seriality occurs within bodies of work Marks and gestures are repeated over time. They become a personal signifier or signature in a sense. So I think that that's just part and parcel of painting, but I'm kind of playing it up a little bit. How did I get interested in this? Mostly through reading Gertrude Stein's work, which I think I started reading in the late 80s probably. And in 1934, she published or gave lectures in America. It was a lecture tour throughout the US, published the lectures in 1935. Portraits in Repetition, she basically says that nothing can be repeated, that everything is always different. So when she says a rose is a rose is a rose, it's every time she says the word, it's slightly different, which I found very, very fascinating. She says in expressing anything, there can be no repetition because each time you use emphasis, and as you use emphasis, it's not possible that you can actually repeat the same way. I found this fascinating. In the introduction to that volume, Wendy Steiner writes that she compares Stein to the pop artists Lichtenstein and Warhol, number one. And she said that Stein's subvertive narrative into repetition and filled repetition with a powerful expressive potential. Again, we think of, before that, we thought of repetition as something deadening, something that loses meaning over time. She's saying, no. It actually adds meaning, adds expressiveness. And then I'm just going to give you a few art historical examples of this idea of repetition. Warhol's disaster series. He's using this kind of lousy image from a newspaper article, makes a screen print of it, repeats that. Each one is a little bit different. It's the same image. There are slight variations in how it's printed on this canvas. It keeps this image in your mind almost in a filmic way where we're watching the same frame again and again. It keeps it in the moment in a sense. Saul LeWitt, a very systemic conceptual artist who's using modules, repeating them into every conceivable variation until he gets to the end of that possibility. So systemic art is definitely a huge influence on me. And again, very much part of this language of repetition. We can go back even further though. I love Bernini, he's one of my favorites. And he was hired to do this portrait of Cardinal Borghese. And the one on the left, he created right about the time it was almost finished. This stone developed a big crack across the forehead. You can see it there. And the commission was due, and Bernini being the virtuoso that he was, the legend has it that he created the second version within 16 days or something like that. And the cardinal came to see the unveiling of the bust, and Bernini first whips the cloth off of the one on the left, the damaged one, and the cardinal was very upset and sad to see this damaged stone. And then Bernini turns around and whips the cloth off of the other one. It's fascinating to me, the idea of revisiting a task multiple times. What do we bring to that? Again, it's a very, Christy mentioned Zen Buddhism and Agnes Martin, and I think there is this meditative, beautiful thing that happens when you are working the same way again and again, and in this case, the same subject and the same pose as much. It's amazing that he pulled this off. We can also look at Impressionism and that revisiting of subjects, different times of day, different atmosphere, different weather, different times of year. The Impressionists were working outdoors much of the time and doing paintings in one sitting. And so that specificity of day and atmosphere and time all became such an important part of their work. Monet's Rouen Cathedral series, there are about 40 paintings in this series. And, obviously they are all so different, although they're also the same. Lichtenstein looked back at Monet and did the Rouen Cathedral series of his own, 5 different paintings. And so this idea that artists are talking to each other through time is also very fascinating to me. I did want to mention Clifford Still because of your beautiful museum there in Denver. I hope you all saw the Repeat, Recreate exhibit a few years ago. I did not know this until this show was mounted, that Still created these replicas of some of his best paintings. We think of abstract expressionism as something that is so full of emotion and psychological import. And the idea that he's kind of methodically creating a painting 2 times is a very conceptual kind of postmodernist idea in many ways. It's kind of mind-blowing that he did this in the 40s. He said that making additional versions is an act I consider necessary when I believe the importance of the idea or the breakthrough merits survival on more than one stretch of canvas. So he's also kind of protecting his idea, making sure it gets out into the world, by making another version of it, which I think is fascinating. I wanted to talk a little bit about gesture because one of the things, probably one of my favorite periods of art history is abstract expressionism. And yet it's one of those things, if you're in grad school and you say you want to be an abstract expressionist, you'd be laughed out of the room. It's too late. It's already happened, right? We have to somehow bring it forward. So this is a detail of a Joan Mitchell painting. And I think, what is gesture? We look at this and we think, oh, emotion, well, I don't know. I look at this, I think, I can't tell if she's happy or sad. I can't tell if she's angry or in love. I don't know what's going on with her when she makes this painting. I think what we can tell is how fast or how slow the brushwork is. We can see how liquid or how stiff the paint body is. We can see, there's a lot of information there, but can we tell her emotional or psychological state of mind? Absolutely not. We cannot. So I'm very curious about this idea, especially now after really we're postmodernism now. And this idea that, postmodernism really kind of undermined the primacy of the maker in many ways. And now we're kind of coming back around a little bit. And yet there's still a lot of suspicion around, well, how can you make a really meaningful gestural painting now? Peter Halley, one of my favorite postmodernist painters, said that after art comes the cultures of transgressions and facsimiles. Here's Roy Lichtenstein in the 60s making one of his brushstroke paintings. And these are meant to be both, kind of an homage to abstract expressionism, but also kind of making fun of it a little bit. It's this enormous, gigantic, overblown brushstroke that he has turned into kind of a graphic, cartoony gesture, right? So he's making fun of it a little bit, but also honoring it. Another one of my favorite artists is Fred Hammersley. He's one of the very first that I know of who made works using a computer in the 60s. And this piece looks almost like a brushstroke. At the same time, the title of it is Clairol. And so he's also it's a little pop art nod. And here's a detail from one of my paintings from a couple years ago. Technology is everything to me. And I think it's the path to bringing painting into the future in a sense. This is my workspace a lot of the time, just this laptop. And I'm very, very basically kind of preoccupied with 2 things equally. One is painting history and the other is this digital realm that we live in, how these things can overlap. I feel like we've lost our ability to look at paintings. We are used to looking at images on a screen, and people are less and less used to looking at things in real life and really perceiving all of the richness there is to perceive there. A question I have is, at what point do algorithmic systems facilitate a new form of expression? And we can go back to a Jacques Ellul quote from 1964, in which he says, the more technological our society gets, the more potential there is for some kind of ecstatic experience, which I think is kind of amazing. This is the year that I was born, and he's saying this. Another question I have is, how are my personal impulses and decisions filtered through computer programs, which are in essence a simulacra of existing systems, activities, and scenarios? So if I'm in Photoshop, there's, and I'm in the painting palette, there's brushes and pencils and erasers, and, it's just like, it's built on what a real studio would be. Same with Illustrator. It's built on, what your graphic design desk would have looked like 50 years ago. So we are kind of filtering our impulses through these programs, which I think is fascinating. And then a quote by Sherry Turkle. She's one of the first to write about this idea that humans and computers, that there's this interface and that computers are affecting us as much as we might think we're affecting them. She thought that the computer has become an object to think with. All of you are of an age where, and so am I, where we grew up without computers. I'm sure you all feel and know that maybe the way that you write has changed in email from how it used to be writing by hand or typing on a typewriter. The way that our minds work is changing. And I think that that's definitely true for me. The paintings that I make could not have been made without the computer. At what point does mathematical and geometric data become natural? Okay, so I think there's a flow at which I'm a part of this thing and it's a part of me. It's not, there's no separateness there. Our bodies essentially are sensors of change, and we become transducers of the virtual, which I think is fascinating. Going to talk a little bit about process. As I said, the paintings are designed on the computer, and then I translate them into these paintings in a very, very traditional, very slow, painstaking, using techniques that are 500 years old. So once I'm actually in the making of the thing, all of a sudden I'm in the past. So this is a painting that's about maybe a quarter of the way done. And here it is when it's finished. Lots and lots of layers of information. Each color that you see is basically painted one on top of the other, built into layers. This picture is maybe from 10 years ago. I used to make a pattern, a paper pattern for every layer that I would trace out with a pencil and then transfer it onto the panel. These days, I'm actually using giant stencils that are basically one-time stencils that are created for each layer of the painting. They're actually cut by a computer. Oh. But everything is still hand painted, but I still go through many miles of masking tape every year. The encaustic layers are painted on with a brush there. Like I said, you can see the dimension of it here. I kind of trim around it with a razor blade, so it's a very kind of crisp, clean shape that has very dimensional form. I keep a lot of very extensive records and color samples and all of that for each painting that I make. For each show that I have, each exhibition that I have is basically created for the space that it's in. So I don't really just work without knowing where the work is going. I think a lot about the gallery that it will be shown in. This is a shot of my old studio in San Francisco. And I'm going to just go through like a couple of shows just briefly. This show was at the New Mexico Museum of Art last year, and unfortunately it was only open for a couple weeks before the museum closed, and now my work has been sitting there for almost a year with no one seeing it. So it's this big painting, and I also in the last couple of years have been making these graphite drawings. They're basically drawings of the paintings. Because I have so much data associated with this work, I have these Photoshop files, I have these Illustrator files. A couple of years ago, I started thinking, well, there's a lot of other things I could be making with all this data. And so I'm making these graphite drawings now. They're basically drawings of the painting. And I also have been doing some sculpture. The first ones were these porcelain small pieces. They're about 7 inches in diameter. They're also derived from the same files that I make the paintings from, but these happen to be manipulated in a 3D modeling program. And then this is 3D printed porcelain and glazed. So it's fabricated somewhere else for me. It comes from my computer files, so. And then I wanted to go back to the Robuchon show and talk about these works. So here's the exhibition in their space. And this painting actually is a painting from 2014, and I still consider it one of the most important works I've ever made. It's about 28 feet long, and it's, as you can see, almost completely symmetrical. There's a few things in there that are not. But the exhibition is called Firmament, and this painting to me is kind of like this universe, and it has this kind of dome shape in it. And the word firmament, kind of in the biblical sense, is this idea of the dome of the sky, the dome of the universe, God's domain. And even though I'm not that interested in the religious connotations, I love this idea of this container. And for me, all of this data that goes into making the paintings, and also the many millions of hours of painstaking physical labor, that it is this world. It's a universe, essentially. And so the show at Robuchon, I kind of wanted to show this painting. This painting has been shown in a couple of different museums, and Robuchon has that beautiful 50-foot long wall. And so I always like to take advantage of that when I have a show there. And I thought, gosh, I'd really like to revisit this piece and create another show around it. So these drawings, again, they are graphite drawings. Each of the 4 drawings is, you can see the painting is made of 8 panels and the piece is symmetrical. So each of the drawings is a drawing of 2 of those panels, but then also multiplied. So they're unbelievably complicated, little tiny graphite marks. A lot of people think they look like they're printed on a computer, but they're all hand drawn. And they're the same size as the painting. So the image is 69 inches tall. The painting is 69 by 28 feet.
Amy, a question. Do you hear me? From Mary Willis. Do we look at your pictures for meaning or to appreciate the process and the beautiful result?
Both, hopefully. I do feel that I'm striving for people to have a more kind of experiential response. So I'm trying to take advantage of, like I said, I want to use all the optical tricks. I want to use all the painterly tricks. I want to engage your eye and have it basically locked into this image where you can't tear yourself away from it. That's the goal for me. I think people usually do pick up on there's some kind of digital thing going on here, but it's usually hard for them to figure out. I think people often respond to the degree of labor in my work, which is extreme. And I think, people bring, it is purely abstract. And I think this idea of staying within this very contained language of forms that I use, I don't really want it. I'm not trying to refer to a landscape or to a this or to a that. People make those associations. I'm trying to create a self-contained world that is not that referential of other things in a literal way, but I think people bring a lot to it. So they might bring landscape into it. They might bring certainly some, like I said, some people pick up on the digital and they bring in this idea of like, oh yeah, this extreme chaotic busyness of the digital. People pick up on the art historical references. So there were the 4 drawings, the giant painting, and then 3 smaller paintings. These are 3 by 3 feet each. And all of this is derived from the big painting. So all very tied into each other and very self-referential. The sculptures in this case, I wanted them to be bigger and I wanted them to be bronze. And so these 3 sculptures are bronze sculptures, again, derived from the digital files that I used to make the painting. Brought into a 3D program, manipulated, and then I send them to this place in Oregon and they create a 3D print of this plasticky, waxy material that is then sent to the foundry. And it's almost like a lost wax method. That thing is melted away and you have this, very kind of traditional, in a way, bronze sculpture that has this evidence. It's almost like I wanted to take the big painting, roll it into ball, send it into outer space and have it kind of floating around as a meteor or something. I wanted to briefly talk about public art. As Helen said, I have an enormous piece at SFO. So if you ever fly through there, it's in Terminal 3. And it's my first big public art project, and it's a ceramic mosaic. It's 10 by 109 feet.
Wow.
And fabricated by some mosaic fabricators in Montreal, Quebec. And here it is being installed. And really a huge honor to have a piece in my hometown airport. I'm currently working on another big mosaic for Sam Houston State University in Texas. And this is the mock-up sketch for it. It's for a brand new building that was built last year. And it was supposed to be installed last year, where we got a little hung up because of COVID, but here's a detail of the mosaic sample. I just got another commission for the San Diego airport, so I'll be doing another big piece. And I wanted to end with, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Sharks Inc., but Bud Shark is really one of the premier print studios in the US. He's been around for over 40 years, worked with artists from all over the country and abroad. And he invited me to come and do a project with him. So I've done 2 now. The first one was in 2019, and I produced these 2 12-color lithos. And again, for me, whether it's the mosaic or printmaking, to be able to work in another medium, it gets the brain working in a different way. The painting I've been doing my whole life, but printmaking is a whole different endeavor. And to be able to work with a master printer and be in his studio producing work is amazing.
I might just add, Amy, if you go to Amy's website, she has a great, what would you call it? A diary of her time there, and it's worth reading. It really is fascinating.
Thank you. This past year, I was invited back and did another pair of lithos. These are both 9-color lithographs and very different from the last ones. I think, because it's learning a new medium for me, it's like, wow, what is possible? And every time you do a new project, you kind of have fresh ideas to bring to it. So these are brand new. This is a detail. And here's the second one. And that's all I got for you.
Thank you, Amy, so much. If you will stop your screen sharing.
Yeah.
The one thing I just wanted to do, because something had happened to my computer, and or I was trying to show. I was trying to show the other pieces at the Denver Art Museum, and for some reason I can't. Okay, right. So there are a few more pieces that Christy had of the art at down at the Denver Art Museum for the contemporary art. So you guys, this has been beyond wonderful, just beyond wonderful. Are there any other questions that you all anything that you all would like to ask before we finish? Terry?
Yes, I would like to ask Amy, so when you make these models on your computer digitally, how many layers are your typical pieces there, especially on the black and whites that you did, and I assume you had to draw them since you hand drew them. How many layers does that? I'm
Well,
trying to wrap my head around.
yeah, thanks. That's a good question. So the drawings are a little different than the paintings. The paintings typically have, 15 to 22 layers or so. And again, each of those is painted one on top of the other in succession in the same way that the Photoshop file is built. When I started, as I said, I started using these big stencils a few years ago. And basically what those are, I'm working in Photoshop, but then I bring the document back into Illustrator and create a vector drawing of it. And then a big pattern or stencil is cut for each of those layers. Those line drawings are so beautiful. I thought, well, I should do something with this. And so the graphite drawings are actually drawings of the Illustrator vector files that I use to make the stencils for the paintings. So there's a lot of this, back and forth. It's a very fluid process. And so those are actually, all the layers are kind of compressed into this pattern, that can be cut. Technically it's the same amount of layers, but I've turned it into a black and white drawing. And then I project that and draw that with a pencil. And so what I'm seeing through the projector is kind of this, a much more pixelated thing again. So there's a lot of pixel versus vector, which all of that is kind of interesting to me, this kind of fluidity between the analog and the digital and all these different programs. There's all these kind of translation points that I think are kind of interesting, where I have to kind of decide which way I want to go.
Well, we want to thank you all again. Hannah, do you have anything you want to say before?
No, I was going to ask, I know we'll start to lose people into R, but Christy, was there anything more at the end of yours that you wanted to add at this point?
Well, it was just a couple of other, what I would consider to be important contemporary movements and how to approach it. But you know what, we could go on with that forever. I do want to underscore Amy's working with Bud Shark. Bud Shark, who is an old friend of mine, that is an unbelievable resource of some of the best printmaking in the world. And he is a master printmaker, and you guys could all go and visit his.
Mhm.
He's a great guy. He's done some unbelievable prints for some terrific artists, including Amy. So I really recommend that as a field trip.
Thank you.
We'll add that. Yeah, we'll add that to our
And
list.
he'd be all about that. He likes to do that. So
Right.
We have, for all of you, we have our programs set out for the year, and we have more and more, so we may end up having to have 2 in a month because we've had such interesting things.
And before we lose everybody, let me just mention our next program is set. It's February 19th. I don't know the time exactly yet, but it's Gary Emmerich, and he is a photographer. So we'll delve into a new field, and we're looking forward to that. So thank you. I think we had 44, 45 people at one point, and
That's one of our highest.
so happy. And Christy and Amy, I could not thank you enough.
Thanks for having me.
no,
That's
it was
a
a lot of fun.
fascinating-
Amy, I really enjoyed listening. See, this is what we need to do to see art.
Yes.
Is to listen. I will never look at your artwork the same way now. It's
Right.
just
Thank you.
so interesting.
Thank you
how
so
you
much.
come
You
up
did
with
a great
those
job of
images.
setting me up.
Yeah,
Thank
no,
you
it was
all. Thank you all
fascinating.
so much for joining us. Have a marvelous weekend. Be safe. Be
Thanks,
safe.
everybody.
Thanks all.
Thanks, you guys.